Thank you so much, Ann-Kathrin, for having me on the AIS SIG Diet PhD Research Academy. It's an absolute pleasure, it's a privilege to have the chance to talk about research on and about and around video games. My sense is that this session is going to be a little different from the previous sessions for those who might have attended those, in the sense that I will not be speaking about my favorite research method, but I will talk about one of my favorite research settings and phenomena, and that is video games. And I'll make 2 points during the session. The first one is I believe that video games are a significant, relevant, interesting, and in fact fun phenomenon by themselves. And the second is that video games can be used to do research on all sorts of individual level phenomena, behavioral, organizational level phenomena, market level phenomena, and so forth. So we'll call that video games as a phenomenon and video games as a research context. And while I'm speaking, you'll be noticing two things. The first one is that video games are not only about play and entertainment, so not only about the hedonic aspect, but also have utilitarian purposes. We can use video games to study education, study learning. We can use them for simulation, training, all sorts of health applications. So video games are really the forebearer of a much larger phenomenon that over the past couple of years uh, people call the metaverse and still do probably. So that's one aspect. And the second and related aspect is I do not believe that we can decouple the course about video games and the emerging metaverse from the discourse around artificial intelligence. Artificial intelligence, that's the next frontier in computation, and video games, in a sense, are the next frontier or the frontier, if you will, of digitally mediated experience. So the two are really interrelated. I'm going to talk about the significance of video games. I'm going to talk about some conceptual understanding of video games that might help us define the boundary conditions. We'll be speaking about how we can collect data on video games, and we'll look at some of the intricacies in collecting data about video games. And towards the end, I'll also be speaking about a study that some colleagues and I, conducted in the video game context. Before we start any research, the very first question that we ask ourselves is, and that's a continuing question, is this important? Or in other words, is this significant? And I'm assuming, you can see my screen in full screen, right? I'm assuming that some of us have read this editorial by Andrew Burton-Jones, Peter Gray, and Anne Matschak from 2023 on doing significant research. And one of the points they make in this editorial is that, yes, research needs to be rigorous. That's a hygiene factor. That's a must. That needs to be a given. However, it's not enough to do relevant research in the sense that it's applicable, but it should also have some implications beyond the academy, beyond academia. So it should have some societal, some social relevance. And I'm not saying, and these authors are not saying, that this means that every research needs to make big social progress, but it needs to contribute to some discourse that eventually helps us make some social progress and benefit society. And in this paper, they're asking 3 questions that we should be asking ourselves when we write papers. First one being, how does this paper address an unsolved challenge in a contemporary phenomenon? And we'll see how video games are a very contemporary, significant phenomenon. how does the paper consider multiple perspectives on this challenge? And video games really require us to take multiple perspectives on this phenomenon. And then, of course, what is the ultimate benefit that our research does for society? So the point I'm going to make is video games are important and we should be studying them, and there's ample opportunity to do so. So talking about the significance, here are some figures on video games from statista.com. The expected 2024 revenue is approaching $300 billion. So clearly this is of economic significance. We can also see a fairly healthy growth rate in the video game market, expected 8 to 9% between 2024 and 2027. And also, when we look at the numbers of who plays video games, we'll notice that in many countries, it's more than half the population. Germany, I think at this point, has 84 million inhabitants, out of which 49 million are expected to play video games. So that's a lot. So we can assume that most of us here play video games or have played video games in some way. When we talk about playing video games, this is really referring to PC, so playing using a desktop computer, consoles, using tablets, and by far the largest market for video games at this point is in fact mobile, so playing on smartphones and such. So economic significance, check. Then video games are socially significant. So first of all, I did mention that earlier, when we talk about games, we're not only talking about, this is very important, hedonic entertainment, joy, and all that, but also utilitarian purposes, such as for educational learning, training, simulation, and whatnot. And another issue that I think is worthwhile mentioning is that in the past, and I think we all know these, know this research and the stories in the past, research has highlighted negative aspects of video games and has shown how video games are associated with socially undesirable outcomes. But we do see research now that highlights also the positive impact of video games on cognitive abilities, motivational abilities, social skills, and so forth. And I think we can immediately relate to that when we think about how we navigate through some 3D space and have to, react fast and so forth and so forth. I took a quote here from Elon Musk because I thought this is anecdotal, clearly, but I thought that's perhaps interesting. Here's what he said: I probably wouldn't have started programming if it wasn't for the video games, or wouldn't have been as interested in computers and tech if it wasn't for video games. I think video games are a very powerful force for getting young kids interested in technology. It has way bigger knock-on effects than people may realize. So I'm just bringing that up because I thought some of us can perhaps relate to that, and having been interested in video games. And so I thought that is interesting. So as I said initially, the way we're going to look at video games is from two perspectives. One is video games as a distinct phenomenon, and the other one is video games as a research context. And I'm getting some help here from two of our colleagues from SIGDITE. Let me go from right to left. So video games as a research context. So one of the beautiful things about video games is that we can use them in order to study all sorts of phenomena, as the aforementioned educational aspects, learning aspects, and so forth. And Nick Berenti said at a PDW, personal development workshop that we did I think last year at the Academy, at the AOM meeting, was that video games are petri dishes. So we can use them to test all sorts of things. And I think he has a point here in the sense that video games are not safety critical systems. They're not critical infrastructure. That doesn't mean nothing can go wrong. And there's, of course, economic interests involved in video games. And they're certainly not a safe space in the sense that it's social interaction and people meet and there's all sorts of ethical concerns, but there is a sort of sandbox-like element to video games. And then our friend and colleague Julian on the other side, he studies esports. And esports for me is one aspect, one subdomain, if you will, of the research field of video games. So he's interested in esports. And he said, I think at the very same meeting, to make esports a reality, organizations had to solve a number of complex problems. Many of these still need to be solved. So what he's saying is there's something very specific about video games as a phenomenon. So ample opportunity to study video games. And now that we're seeing Nick Berenti here, and I see Jan Recker is also joined and is in the audience. So that's two co-authors of a very famous editorial published in MIS Quarterly on managing artificial intelligence. And Jan, you can correct me, but I think what the editorial is saying, among other things, is that artificial intelligence can be many different things. So there's unsupervised learning, there's supervised learning, there's reinforcement learning, and so forth. So we can't just say we study AI. However, what we can do is we can look for what is essential about artificial intelligence. And I think you have three things in that paper: inscrutability, learning, and what's the third one? Autonomy. So these authors are trying to abstract away from those idiosyncrasies of all these different implementations that exist. And I want to do something similar for video games. So we can't just say we study video games because that means many different things, but we can ask the question about what is it that's essential about video games and how can we perhaps use that in order to define some boundary conditions of video games. And here's one important, perhaps distinct feature of video games. They have agreed upon rules. These rules are associated with goals, they're associated with defined outcomes. And what is interesting about rules in video games is that they are related to what's called the game's mechanics. The game's mechanics is how you move through a game, how you win, how you score, how you, whatever matters for that game. So in a way, the mechanics of a game implement those rules. If you look at what we have in the upper right corner, that's, by the way, a Gen AI generated, DALL-E generated image. This is supposed to show that you're moving through something that in video games is called a dungeon. So you can go straight ahead, you can turn right, you can left, perhaps you can jump or something like that. But the physics of the game are an implementation of the rules, and that becomes perhaps clearer in the bottom example, and that is referring to an issue that is important in a genre that's called shooter games in video games. And this is whether there's friendly fire or not. So whether it matters if you hit your teammates or not. And if it does matter, that's an implementation of a rule, and that's fundamentally changing how the game works. So the outcomes of a video game, whether you win, whether you lose, so the actual consequences depend on those rules and how they're enacted by a player. That's sometimes called the player's agency. Another important aspect, which is interesting also from a digital innovation perspective, certainly, is that rules can change. And as rules change, the outcomes can change. So the developers of video games, but also individuals, people who create what's called mods based on video games, variations of video games, can change these rules and can create very different experiences. So rules, this is something that we need to keep in mind when we speak about video games. And the other thing I'm taking from the MIS Quarterly AI editorial is that there's not just one thing that's a video game, but there's very many different flavors. And these flavors are sometimes referred to as genres. And whoever wants to study video games should have some idea of what these genres are. I picked one conceptualization here from a paper that distinguishes two dimensions. One is whether a game is how social a game is. Is it non-social? That means, is it just the individual player engaging with the game, or is it a very social game? That means multiple people interacting to create some outcome. And the other one is the game's complexity in terms of mechanics and rules. And now we can start locating different genres, different types of games, specific games, of course, also in the system. Let's pick, so role-playing games, RPGs. RPG means role-playing games. A solo role-playing game would be complex because it has fairly sophisticated mechanics. A lot can happen, but since it's played by one player, it's a rather non-social game. On the other hand side, we have something that's called MMORPG. So that'll be massively multiplayer online role playing games. So the same, just in a massive online setting. And that would be a very social experience because people interact. There's going to be emergent behavior in those games and so forth. If we go back to the esports topic that we mentioned earlier, there's sports games. Like it used to be called FIFA, now it's got a different name, I think. So that'll be very social because you interact with plenty of other people, but the rules are fairly standard and known, like the rules of soccer, for instance, that are then implemented in the mechanics of the game. Guitar Hero might be something you would want to turn to if you're interested in the embodied experience that comes with games, because it has a fairly prevalent physical element, the guitar that people use when they engage with those games. So video games can take very many different forms. From a digital innovation perspective, it is interesting to think about what sort of artifacts, and also from a design perspective, of course, what sort of artifacts are we looking at. Oh, I have a different slide here. Let's talk about that real quick before we get to the artifacts. So talking about genres. At this point, there is some fairly, I would say, stable understanding of what are the prevalent genres in video games. So for instance, there's aforementioned role-playing games, there's action games, there's sports games, there's strategy games and real-time and round-based strategy games and whatnot. So many different genres, but these genres had to emerge and be created at some point. And sometimes there is one game or there are a couple of games that stand out and that really define a new genre. So in the early 90s, there was a game called Doom. And then in the subsequent years, people would make games that looked like Doom or were like Doom or implemented some of the mechanics as in implemented rules of Doom. And those games were then called Doom clones. At this point, no one's talking about Doom clones anymore, but people started to abstract away, see what's essential about this genre, and now speak about first-person shooters, which is one of those more important genres of video games. Yeah, and then there's the artifactual question. So what is it that we're looking at? And you might be surprised by the first one, which is video games as physical artifacts. There's a very tangible physical element to video games. That's the input devices, for instance. We're looking at a controller here. Or if you go back in time a little bit, those arcade games that would have in video game playing halls. So they also foregrounded the physical experience in playing games. So we can extend that. So it's not only input devices or perhaps the VR headsets we're using, but it can be things like the packages in which a game is shipped and that people collect, or what's called a case mod. So that's a variation, a mod of the case that the computer is in, right? So they have colorful cases. Adding to the experience. Then, of course, we can look at video games from the perspective of digital artifacts. So they're pervasive, they're virtual, they're implemented through software and bit strings, they're malleable. So all of those properties that we're associating with digital artifacts. And of course, games are socially constructed. So when we look at video games, and this is, by the way, a perspective that is fairly prevalent in a literature that's called game studies, where people study video games. And that is how video games are really getting the meaning from the interaction as people engage with the video game. Here's a quote: "Games must be played as their meanings are inherently co-created in a dialogue between game developers, game systems, and game players." So the game is really not only a function of the software and the content it provides, but also the way that people engage with games. And sometimes, aside from the mechanics, there is a certain conventions, for instance, emerging games. Conventions can have some arbitrary components, so how you behave in a game, for instance. So this is different perspectives that we can take on to look at video games. And I would want to add one more because I believe it's a useful perspective. And this is conceptualizing games as experience spaces. And this is where that's my colleagues Gregory Yepes and Nick Brenti and Jeff Nicholson, draw on some work of another famous SIG-DITE member, and that's Yang Jin Yu's ideas around experiential computing. So let me try to illustrate the idea. So imagine you're in some game setting, three-dimensional sort of experience like what you see here. And we can conceive of that as some digitally mediated experience. So there's certain elements that matter. There's the space. So in this example, that'll be three-dimensional. There's certain artifacts that we can engage with. There's a truck. Perhaps we can use that truck. There's what else do we have? A plane, and so forth. There's actors. These actors in games can be of two types. They can be human actors, other players, that is having the social experience, but they can also be machine actors. They're called NPCs, non-playable characters. And these NPCs can be implemented in various ways. They can be rule-based, so they keep doing the same stuff. They can be learning agents, but we're engaging with these agents and they create very different experiences. There's an aspect of time. Games can be fast-paced, they can be slow-paced, and some people like fast-paced games and other people like slow-paced games and so forth. And then at some time, what happens is that we want to have a different experience. So we're moving into a different space to have that experience. For instance, we might be done with our first person shooter and we want to go to a concert. And this is, by the way, so these are no screenshots. This is DALL-E generated, but this is based on an actual real world example that happened during the time of the pandemic. There was a concert hosted on the Unreal platform by Epic Games, a Travis Scott concert, and people moved from the game into that concert and could have a very different experience. And then we can perhaps move to again a different experience and so forth. So what's happening here is that people are moving from one digitally mediated experience to another. And these experiences can be designed in very different ways, and there can be very different rules in each of these experiences or experience spaces. And one of the challenges is how you design those transitions, how you get from one experience to another experience to another experience. And this is where we can make the connection to what we said initially about so these arrows are supposed to indicate the transition. This is where we can make the connection to what we said initially about the metaverse, because one way to look at the emerging metaverse is it's going to be lots of different experiences that are interrelated experiences. So we can have them, and they can be work-related experiences, they can be game-related experiences, they can perhaps be health-related settings and so forth. And challenge is how do we design these transitions of getting from one experience to another. I understand this is a little abstract, so I'll give you a real world example. This is an image I think my colleague Jeff Nicholson constructed for a paper we wrote, and it's indicating two different types of transitions. So let's look at the left first. So this is, I think, how experiences mostly work for us in the real world. So they're sequential. So we're having an experience, we're sitting at our computer and we're interacting through Zoom as we're doing right now. And then perhaps we move to another room, or we move away from the work setting and we transition to home or something like that. So there's transitions and there's a temporal element, and we move from one place to another. So now think about playing video games. You're sitting in front of your computer. Perhaps you're using some platform like Steam. Perhaps you're using Discord as a meta channel to chat with your friends, and then you engage in a certain experience and you play a video game. But at some point, you're like, no, we don't want to play this anymore. We want to do something else. So you go back to the Steam platform, you start another video game, right? So you go back to one point, and the transition is very different to the type of transition that we have in the real world, and probably not really what we want in the future as we're moving from one experience to another. So why am I telling you all this? If you look at video games from the perspective of experiences and interrelated experiences, this raises a bunch of questions and points to a bunch of phenomena. And this then opens up interesting research questions. So for instance, studios. Studios are one important stakeholder in the video game business. Studios are those companies that make video games. develop video games. Some studios create engines that others can then use to create experiences. Game engines are software frameworks that you need in order to implement video games. So famous examples for game engines would be the Unreal Engine by Epic, and Fortnite is using that, for instance. Another famous one would be Unity, and there's others. Some studios have game engines that they just use for their own games, for instance. Some license them and sell them. Then there's the studios that create experiences. So that's the actual real games that people can engage with. And that's another thing that we can study. So for instance, we can ask, how are these games developed? What are the development processes and so forth? And later in the session, I will be speaking about a study where we studied how video games are made. We're going to look at some data-informed practices around making video games. Then there's publishers. Publishers can have multiple studios, own multiple studios, and they want to market these experiences. And a huge part of the budget that goes into video games is budget for marketing and making people aware that these games exist. The market is growing and it's a big market, but at the same time, it's very competitive. And actually, making people notice that there's a new game is difficult for the big publishers, but is even more difficult for the smaller publishers or even independent developers. Again, another phenomenon that we can study. Platforms provide markets for experiences. So there's all these developers, all these studios and publishers, there's all these independent developers, and they want their games to get attention, get good ratings. And then there's the users who pick these games and play them and might be disappointed or might not be disappointed. Again, plenty of space to study video games. There's the developers, people who actually make video games. They might be part of studios. They might be independent developers. By the way, independent developers are those folks that make what's called indie games sometimes. And once in a while, an indie game becomes very, did I freeze, Ann-Kathrin? Okay, still see me.
We can still see and hear you.
Okay, good. Yeah, and then there's users, of course, and users engage in experiences. And this is what we call in-game. So game companies can collect all the data that is generated as users engage with the game. And that can be solo, so in games that do not require social interaction, and that can be in multiplayer games that are social and that do require social interaction. And we can study emerging social behavior. We can study how the way that people engage with games changes. We can even study how the institution of gaming changes over time. And then users interact about experiences. I think that is one of the most prevalent sources that people use, because as people are excited about games, they go on social media and they discuss. There's Reddit forums on literally every larger game. And so there's plenty data that can be used to analyze. So just to give you a sense of, as we start to look at games as experiences, what sort of phenomena exist that we can conceivably study. And then, of course, the big question is, how do we collect data on games? And the good news is it's very simple to collect data about games. The bad news is it's very hard to collect data about games. It's very simple because there's many different data sources that we can tap into. It's very hard, at least because the gaming industry is, for good reasons, very protective of the data, because that's what they use in order to generate insights that others don't have. And so that's a bit of a challenge. So let's look at some potential data sources. So if you're interested in users as a unit of analysis, of course, one can do surveys. One can study social media, get some data from Reddit and see what are individual perceptions, perhaps, of video games after new releases, after updates, after a new game is added to a franchise or something like that. Then there's user reviews. It's a little related to social media, but also different in the sense it's a little more structured, and we can find these reviews on platforms like Steam or on Metacritic. And then there's in-game analytics, and that's really interesting, and that's where it becomes hard. So how do people actually interact with the games? And basically there's two options. One is you are in control of the game. You perhaps host it, you perhaps have it in some controlled setting, and you can track user behavior. The other one is that you get data from those who develop games. Probably that's a little easier for games that are by independent developers than from the big studios. Games in themselves can be unit of analysis. We can think of game content analysis, playing games, using some tools to analyze game elements, for instance, the assets that are in a game.
Stefan, I don't know about all the others, but seems like I can't hear you anymore. Okay, people are commenting same, so seems like you can't hear us. One moment, everybody. We can't hear you anymore. Okay, guys, we're just trying to fix the problem and then we'll continue, okay?
Is this working again? Okay, good. Huh. Give me a second. Sorry, that's unfortunate. So thought I had recharged this. Clearly not enough. So you can hear me and see my slides again. Okay, so we're talking about collecting data, and the point that I was making is it's easy to collect data because there's so much and there's so much variety, but it's tough because the industry is and needs to be protective, and we're just talking about collecting data about games as a unit of analysis. And I think I just mentioned game content analysis, where we play games and we understand games, which is one of the things that we did in the study that I'm going to present, among other things. Playtest data is what game companies collect before they launch a game, but we can also think of playtest data or play data for that matter if we launch a game in some sort of controlled setting. There's market level data available on platforms like Steam, such as on game sales, playtime, so plenty of opportunities. Perhaps this is a good point where I should say that the story about games I'm telling you here is, of course, one specific perspective on games. My background is in qualitative research. I like to do exploratory studies. I like to identify patterns in what people do as they engage with technologies and then theorize about that. So I'm saying that because depending on who would tell you this story about video games, they would probably take a very different angle. And I can see that the econometric angle could be very prevalent. And quite a few studies that were just published recently actually take that angle. One of the things that I'll be doing after this session is I'll be supplying some links, some literature in different categories that Anne-Catherine you can perhaps then put online, and that give you an idea. That'll give you an idea of the breadth of the research on video games that we're now seeing, and that's been emerging in our field. So Collecting data about video games, that's a challenge, but also there's plenty sources available. And I think this is where there is an interesting opportunity. And this is where we can see the intersection between the latest developments in artificial intelligence and also video games. The way that video games are created these days is using systems that can generate tons of content, large amounts of content. People want to play in vast game worlds, for instance. They want new content. So all of this needs to be made. And clearly generative AI is bringing this to a new level. So using tools to generate contents in video games has been used for a long time under notions like procedural generation, where rule-based systems were used in order to generate contents, but now we have Gen AI. And we can generate contents, we can generate artifacts, we can generate entire game spaces. But what is perhaps even more interesting than generating all of these different elements is that we can also generate the rules and mechanics for video games. And you've probably seen a game like what you see on the right-hand side, sometimes like 20 years ago or something like that. And I prompted, apologies for the prompt, it's not very polished, but I prompted ChatGPT to generate some code for generating a game. And so this literally took me a minute. And I had Python code for this game. I think I tweaked it like once or twice in order to get what you see here. But at this point, it's fairly simple to generate various versions of a video game. So I can adjust the rules. I can, for instance, adjust the speed of the game, and that'll be implemented in the mechanics, and it'll be a very different game. So I can think of all sorts of variations that I can implement in order to have different versions of this game. And we can think of, for instance, doing experiments using these games. So here's sorry, there's some issue with my internet connection. Okay. Can you see the next, sorry, Ann-Kathrin, can you see the next slide? No, can't. No,
yeah, yes.
Yeah, no, it just
now
jumped. So I clicked like 4 times and it took a while, and now it's okay. So what can this be used for? So this idea of generating various versions of some video game, we can develop controlled settings for experiments and establish causality in a way that's perhaps more productive than in the past, because we can generate all these variations. We can change the rules, we can change the mechanics implementing the rules, we can change social assortativity, so who's mingling with whom, for instance. We can change contents. We can then implement trackers and study interaction patterns and user behaviors. And here's just some examples of what we can do with such a study. We can study reaction times, motor skills, cognitive load, learning and skill acquisition, attention and focus, the effects that games have on our behavior. We can identify emerging patterns. You'll notice that I'm really lumping together all sorts of questions with very different assumptions here. But my point really is we can use this as a research setting, and Gen AI is giving us ample opportunity to implement this and do this. And this is reflective of the way that video games have in fact been developed for quite a while now. So video games are, of course, made by humans. There's artists, there's what's called tech artists. That's artists that also have technical skills. There's the developers that work on the engines. There's producers and production managers and all sorts of roles. But also there's tools that are being used. And that can be fairly basic digital tools like drawing for constructing concept art, but it can also be tools that implement autonomous behavior and generate not only contents and artifacts, but also the rules of video games. And if you look at video game development processes, they can, and also parts of them can be located on a continuum from what we would conceive of as traditional design to very machine intense design. And the last 2 years have changed this in the sense that there's now easier available generative AI that's really changing the industry. So we're speaking about video games as a research setting. We spoke about their significance. We spoke about some conceptual perspectives we can take on video games. We did mention data collection about video games, and we briefly mentioned the opportunities for studying video games that originate in the availability and advancements in generative AI. And now I want to talk briefly about a study that my colleagues and I did with one of the bigger video game publishers, and that is Ubisoft. And here's my colleagues, Carl Werder, Jan Recker, who's here, Nick Berenti, John Gibbs, Nurdin Abu, and Yosef Ben-Segadi. And this was published in the California Management Review in 2020. And in this study, this is a qualitative study, case study. We had the opportunity to study a studio and game developer, and that is a rare opportunity, I guess. And the game that we looked at was what's called a AAA title. When you hear AAA, that's the really big scale, expensive game projects that then need a lot of customers that need to sell hundreds of thousands, ideally millions of times in order to be economic successes. And we studied one of those very successful games, which is called Ghost Recon Wildlands. In terms of the genre, that's what's called a third person. It's a third person perspective. It's a so-called tactical shooter, I think. It was the largest open beta in Ubisoft's history with almost 7 million players. It was a top selling game within the first few months after it was launched. And just looking at the numbers, it involved roughly 3,000 people. So that's a really large scale software product. And the question we asked is, how do video game developers, does this company in this case innovate on their product before and after launch? That was the question we were asking. And this is the data sources we collected. So first of all, since this is a case study, we did interviews. So we had the opportunity to speak to people who were involved in deciding on and making changes to the game. So video games, as we said earlier, are a digital product. There's some malleability, so they can be changed even after the launch. So we interviewed people who were involved in decisions about these changes and implementing the actual changes, executive producers, game analysts, performance directors, brand managers, and so forth. And that would help us understand what data they used, what data sources they used. We understood their decision-making processes and how they would justify the various decisions they made around games. We would understand the different types of game changes. So there's the major updates, there's the bug fixes that they make, and all of these, of course, involve different decisions at different scale. We also use some archival, publicly available data, like from the game website, forum data, YouTube. And one of the things that are accessible for video games are patch notes. And we use patch notes from 19 updates. So updates can be of various scales. As I said earlier, that can be really a new version of the game, that can be bug fixes. We watched videos on game trailers and looked at roadmaps for the timeline of how the video game would develop. This helped us understand how the game developed over time. It helped us what types of changes were introduced to the game, and we also understood how the game company communicated about these changes. And then, and this is really one of the points that I wanted to highlight, we also did observation. So we collected in-game experience. So we played the game. So we understood the artifact that we were studying. And that would help us really get at the changes that were implemented and how they related to the experience that people would have, that people had in that specific video game. And we did find three key practices they use in order to innovate on their digital product. And let's look at the figure on the right. So there's what we call a data lake here. So that's the different types of data they tapped into for their innovation practices. Communication data is the data they collected as they communicated about their game, advertised it, for instance, so the sort of feedback, the number of clicks they would get on specific advertisements and so forth. Community data is what you find on social media as people talk about a game. Market research data is market research data. And then the really interesting part, I think, is the in-game data. And there were two key aspects here. So one is in-game data in the sense of the way that people engage with the game, the assets they use, what they pick up, where they go, who they meet. So that's in-game data. And then there's pilot or playtest data. And this is the situation where in a controlled setting, people play the game. Of course, that also involves checking what people do. It involves identifying issues like glitches that exist with the game. And typically that's followed by surveys where people asked how they liked the game, how they liked specific features of the game. And I'll just give you one example of what happened here, and that's related to this practice of data-driven exploration. And Jan, you can correct me. So I'm fortunate to have a co-author here if I get any of this wrong. So data-driven exploration is this idea looking at in-game data, so trace data of how players move through the game in order to identify patterns of how they move through the game. And this is where interesting aspects were surfaced. So for instance, you can see what regions in the game space. So this is a huge three-dimensional game space mimicking the country of Bolivia, where people moved. And they use that to introduce what's called a heat map and a heat map feature. So as you were then playing the game, you could look at the heat map feature and see what might be interesting areas in the game that you might want to go to. I should mention that this particular game is what's called an open world game. So you're fairly free in how and where you move and what decisions you make in the game. So based on the analysis of patterns of in-game behavior, the developer was able to identify patterns and then from these patterns develop a new feature. And by the way, there's all sorts of interesting behaviors in these games that are unexpected, which sort of speaks to what we said earlier when we said that the actual game is a co-creation of developers and the game system itself and the players that engage with the game and then co-create experiences. So here are a couple of ideas of how we can tackle the challenges that are involved in studying games, some suggestions of what we can do to study games. The first one is simple, I guess, get exposed, get immersed, try out different genres, play games. And if you don't want to spend much money, there's plenty free games that we can play. But this really helps us understand the phenomena that we study here and get a feeling for what genre and what mechanics might be useful for studying what problem. We do need to consider key literatures where much progress has been made in our understanding of games. And I think that's again an analogy to the artificial intelligence discourse that we're having in our field, because that is also relating to something that's been studied in other fields for decades and there's plenty of knowledge. So we need to look left and right to make sure that we're not reinventing the wheel and consider what other people did. And of course, import that to the discourse that we want to have. And in video games, there is a field that's called video game studies. Of course, human-computer interactions made plenty contributions to video games and video game development. And then there's game development in the sense of software engineering and other computer science fields that matter. The hardest part is perhaps building partnerships with video game publishers, with studios, with independent developers to get close to what's happening. There's more and more independent developers now because there are some platforms that support the creator's economy, the creator economy, in the sense that individuals can create experiences and offer them on a platform. Probably the most famous example at this point is, again, Fortnite. It's called Fortnite Creator, and they're using the engine that Fortnite's providing to allow for users to generate and sell effectively experiences, or monetize them at least. And then we should think creatively about the data sources that we use, how they can be combined, and how we can analyze them. And this is where I see a relationship to quite a few other sessions in the SIG Diet PhD Academy, including on computational theory construction and process, analyzing processes for developing theory, and so forth. To conclude, games are a significant phenomenon, but they also provide context to study all sorts of other phenomena. One defining feature of games is that they have rules, and these rules are embedded in their mechanics, but they're malleable rules. They can be changed. I do believe games, and that's not only me, but games are a forebearer of a much broader phenomenon, the metaverse. And studying games means that we can study those 3D experiences, different and new types of interactions that will matter in this new version of the internet. And also, we made a point about how some of the developments around generative artificial intelligence provide much opportunity for studying video games. Thank you so much for listening to me. That's all I got.